as I said when I started out, it hasn't stopped yet. This is a book from 2009 in which Paul Bunyan's sister, Paula, is the hero, and she discovered, much to her astonishment, that the environment is being ruined, that the trees are being harvested, the animals are being killed, and the basic plot of this book is that she goes and rescues the poor endangered animals and saves the forest. So that Bunyan, being used for propaganda purposes, has come full circle. Now the Bunyan icon is being used for an environmental message, which is much more what we want to hear than 1914s were a big tree cutting company. So that's how it happened. That's how we went from the guys on the left to the guys on the right. If you'd like to pursue this in more depth, I'd recommend you get a copy of the book. I'll move them down to the back and be happy to sell you one for $25 and inscribe it to anyone you like. Seems to me every cottage up north ought to have this book. Don't you think so? No, seriously, if you'd like to, they're available. But before that, I'd like to spend a few minutes answering questions if you have any.
Well, you mentioned an Esther Shepherd who wrote a book. Did she have any connection to that Jean Shepherd way back in the beginning, the one that started all this?
The question is, were the two Shepherd people related? No relation whatsoever. He was here in Rhinelander and she was out on the West Coast. She grew up in Minneapolis, but moved to the West Coast. One odd thing about her is that she married two different men named Shepherd, and they spelled the name differently, one with an E and one with an A. So it's kind of hard to figure out exactly where she was and what she wrote. Another?
You mentioned in your book that Jean Shepherd's papers were scattered because he married two different women and they inherited them. Has there ever been an effort to try to track those papers down?
Yeah, the question is what happened to Jean Shepherd's papers so we could find out whether or not he really did invent Bunyan. His first wife divorced him for good reason, and his second wife came to hang him. And in the settlement of the divorce, everything that he owned went to the first wife, including presumably his books and papers. There might not have ever been many papers because he left school at 15, 16. He grew up in rural Wisconsin, was not well educated, left school at a young age. And it's unlikely that he actually kept many papers. There are some papers at the Rhinelander Public Library, and there's a book about him by a guy named Kurt Kortendorf, which is cited in my book, which is quite good. But I went up to Minneapolis and met with Kurt and looked at all of his papers, and there's just not any evidence. We're never going to know.
You mentioned how many people worked in the logging camps in 1890. Where did you get that figure? Because there weren't, the census of 1890 has been destroyed.
Actually, the population schedules that list the individuals was almost all destroyed, but they had already made all the tabulations by then.
Okay.
So the statistical data survives.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. But you can't trace any people. Very sharp. You must do genealogy.
Do you ever see any indication that there might have been a historical figure that that predated some of these stories that that might have led to some of these stories?
Yeah. For those of you over here, the question was: is there any evidence of a historical figure that could have been the model for Paul? That Bunyan could have been model one. There have been lots of theories, starting as early as 1930. People started looking for models. Some people said he was modeled on a French-Canadian folklore character named Bunyan, and that's where Bunyan came from. But in fact, that character is a little guy. He's named Petit Jean, and folklorists in Canada have never been able to find a Bunyan story. So that didn't pan out. Another widely cited, you'll see this in encyclopedia articles, widely cited mistake says that Bunyan was a fighter in an 1837 rebellion of French Canadians against the English. But when that was investigated by historians, and the English kept great records of who they captured and arrested for this, there's no one named Bunyan mentioned in the records. And again, the Canadian authorities say, nope, the only people up here who mentioned Bunyan came from Wisconsin and Michigan. There are other less known things, but there doesn't seem to be a historical model. If someone in Wisconsin coined the name around 1880, we don't know where he took it from. John Bunyan was the author of Pilgrim's Progress, which until the 20th century was the best-selling book in English after the Bible. So Bunyan was a very well-known name, and if you wanted to choose a name everybody would know, you would choose Bunyan.
I always thought that Paul Bunyan originated in Minnesota
Yeah.
rather than Wisconsin, but
Everybody thinks that. Everybody thinks that. The reason for that is because in the 1940s and 50s, folklore became a scholarly field. And academic folklorists began to look at folklore of all kinds. But some of them looked at the Paul Bunyan stories and said, where did they come from? And at that time, all the furthest they could get back was that 1914 pamphlet from the Red River Lumber Company and Lofthead, who was a public relations guy. And so they said, this isn't folklore, this is fake lore. And it started in Minnesota with an advertising campaign. But the reason they couldn't get back any further than that was because all of the archives where the information was still in private hands. It hadn't yet come together into libraries, so they couldn't see it. I don't know if anybody would have bothered. But what I did over the last couple of years was go look at all that unpublished stuff and say, where did they get their sources? How did they get these stories? And I mapped out, there are charts in the book, I mapped out the history of individual stories and where they're first mentioned in manuscript and where they're first mentioned in print and so forth. And that gets back to 1880 Wisconsin. But nobody's really looked at Bunyan much since since the 1960s. So it's not that, I mean, they get it wrong because they couldn't get it right. It was impossible for them to do. But I've been invited to go up to the Twin Cities in, I think in April, and give this talk at a booksellers association. And I don't know, I might get pelted with eggs or something like that because I'm saying one of their heroes is not really theirs. Anything else? Great questions, and it's just 3 o'clock. Thank you for coming, and I'll relocate down there to the table with some books if anybody would like to buy one.